Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Okay. We need to talk about Stom. It's there. It's in our text. It's a story that is pretty much everybody knows it, we think, or people think they know it, and we need to unpack it a little bit and talk about Stom. Because really the question is, what's the Jewish problem? Why do we have this text there? What is it supposed to be telling us? Because it never clearly tells us what it's supposed to be telling us. So we read it, and we're left with questions. We assume we get it. We assume we know what the problem is. The problem is the townspeople. The problem is what they want to do to the three strangers who have come, the angels, the two angels who are staying with Lot. We think that's the problem. We think that's the problem because we're listening to ancient voices, and particularly medieval voices, that are telling us, here's the problem with what's going on in Stom. And they're focusing in on that one moment. And what happens is, we don't revisit it. And we don't ask ourselves, is that what the text is telling us when we pull back and look at the full picture of it? What's the message? So I want to summarize what's going on in the Torah. The Torah tells us that we have these angels who have appeared at Avram's tent, and Avram runs out to greet them, brings them in, washes their feet, extremely hospitable, goes and kills an animal to feed these three guests, an entire animal. And then Sarah's baking up for an army. If you look at what the menu is that they're treating these guests to, it's an enormous amount of food. And the hospitality is just brimming. It's astounding. And it gives us the Jewish values of hospitality that we learn from what we're watching here. And meanwhile, the angels, one of them delivers a message about the upcoming birth of Isaac, and we know that these particular angels they're very focused. One angel, one mission. So 3 angels arrive, 2 angels leave. Those angels are headed over to Stom because God has shared with Avram, something's going on over there. I'm hearing screams. I'm hearing an outcry. I'm sending them to see what's going on over there. And if it's as bad as we think, I'm done with them. I'm getting rid of them. And that's where we have that bargaining where Avram says, really? You're going to get rid of all of them? What if there's some righteous people in there? And we know the haggling back and forth. We bring it down to 10. The angels now appear in Stom, and they head straight for the city center. Lot sees them and impresses on them. Lot is Avram's nephew. Impresses, come stay at my house. And they say no. And he says, no, you must come stay at house. They say no. And he really pushes on them that they need to come, and ultimately at the end, they do go. After they go in, we're told, not long, the townspeople surround Lot's house, demanding that Lot take out those strangers, bring them to the townspeople, because the townspeople want to sexually assault them. And they're very clear, that's what they want to do, very specifically. And Lot is protecting those townspeople, saying no, the men, the guests, saying no, I will not bring them out here, I will not allow this. And then, he has an innovative solution, but before we get to his innovative solution, everything focuses in on the townspeople, all the commentaries, everything we read about since then is, here's the problem with Stom. The problem is those townsmen. The townsmen want to have their way with the other men that are guests. That is sexuality of one man to another man, and that is where all the focus says, there's your problem. The problem is with the homosexuality that the text is talking about. And then it's as if that's all we hear. That's what we hear, that's all we're taking from it. And I emphasize that because Lot's response is to say to the townsmen, don't do that. Here, I have 2 innocent daughters. Take them. And it's astounding that that's his response. And he's offering these women. So when we look back and we say, I have really a complex narrative here, and the Torah never tells me what's the problem with Stom. The Torah's only told me there is a problem. God has gone to check out, is it as bad as God is hearing the outcry, but then never tells us what is the problem. Because the problem is there's so many problems. It isn't one problem. It's filled with problems. It's filled with problems start to finish when we look at what's going on. We start by the fact that when the angels strangers, come into the city, they head for the city town. That's important, they head for the center. Because in the ancient world, that's what you do. If you're a stranger in a city, you head to the market. The market is at the center. You wait for people to identify you. They will immediately identify strangers, and they will invite you home so that you have where to sleep when the sun sets. Strangers are supposed to wait in the marketplace, in the center of the city, to be invited home. Nobody is inviting these strangers home. Lot is coming and insisting they come home, and they're telling him no, because they want to be invited by other people. They want to see what is the culture of the place. Why is he insisting? Because he knows how Sodom treats strangers. He's trying to protect them. He wants to bring them into the shelter of his home. So immediately we have a red flag because he's insisting so much and nobody else is inviting them. Problem number one. Then they go in. We obviously see the problem of what's going on with the townspeople. And before we get into that too much, let's look at his solution. His solution is to offer the daughters. I have a problem with that. That's your answer? Is for a father to turn to a mob and say, why, please, I have 2 innocent daughters, don't you want them? And I'm shocked. To me, that's a huge problem that Lot is doing that. The town response to his offer is, oh, I see, you're going against us. You're the immigrant, and they're very clear about that. You're not from here, you're the immigrant. He's an immigrant, he's raised his family there. He's lived there most of his adult life. And yet they immediately head to, you're not one of us. You're an immigrant. We're going to do worse to you than we were going to do to them. And I have a problem with that as well. At what point does the newcomer merge and join? Apparently, according to Sodom, at no point. You're always the stranger, you're always the immigrant, you're always the outsider. We will treat you differently, we will treat you worse. That's exactly what they've just said to them. And yet when we read it, we seem to only focus on the townspeople saying, well, we want those men. When there's so much else going on in that narrative. We miss the full story because we're hyper-focused on that one moment. And if we look at that moment and the culture that was just described, we would conclude that the men of Sodom are not gay. This is not an expression of sexual preference. These men are abusive. That's very different than how we've been reading it. What we see going on in this text is that sex is being used as a weapon to assert dominance and power and territory. They're sending a message, and the message they're sending is strangers are not welcome here. We don't want them here. The message seemed to be delivered when nobody invited them in as the sun was setting. They should have left. But the message wasn't received. They ended up staying at Lot's, and so now the townsmen show up to deliver that message. It's similar to what we see sociologically going on in prisons when relationships are formed. They're the relationships of power, dominance, and territory. It's when sexuality is being used as a weapon. And we have to recognize that that's what's going on. This is a highly male-dominant culture. And so what they say to any man who shows up in their territory is, I will treat you like I treat a woman. I will emasculate you. That's what they're trying to do. It has nothing to do with their sexual preferences. They're delivering a very strong message we're supposed to read, but we're supposed to read it in context. This story is in juxtaposition to Avram's household. When these same strangers showed up in Avram's household, there was extreme hospitality, over-the-top hospitality. And when they show up in Sodom, it is extreme abuse. It is over-the-top abuse. We are looking at the Torah showing us 2 cultures side by side. And we're supposed to see exactly how they speak in contrast to each other. Lot misunderstands the situation. He thinks the problem is the sexuality, and therefore he offers women. But we're appalled by his offer. How can you possibly think that's the answer to this moment? You've misunderstood the problem. And when we look at the answer, we begin to ask ourselves, well, how is he the hero? Those angels are looking for righteous people. Lot stands out as a righteous person, and then I hear that offer, and you're thinking, how is he possibly the hero? And And in order to understand that, we realize that we look at the distinction we have in Judaism between two kinds of thieves. One is called a ganav, and one is called a gazlan. And we don't have similar English translations. We could say a thief or a robber, but they're synonyms in English. They are not synonyms in Hebrew or in the Talmud. They're very different. A gazlan is someone who steals openly, during the day, daylight. That's when they rob, that's when they steal. A ganav is someone who does it at night in secret. We treat them differently if they're caught. A gazlan gets less of a fine and less of a punishment. A ganav, we throw the book at him. Why? Because of the preference they stated in the crime. When someone steals during the day, they are saying, I know God can see me. I know you can see me. I'm doing this anyway. At least he's equating God and people. When someone does it at night, they're saying, I know God can see me. I don't care. I want to make sure you can't see me. And now what they've done is they've elevated the opinion of people above God. So we hit them with a harder fine. And we say that's a worse statement to make. In understanding that, we look at Lot. And we say Lot knows very well how Sodom will react if he shelters these strangers. But he does it anyway. Because he learned the values of hospitality with Avram and Sarah. He was raised in that household. He brought them into himself, and he brought them into his home, and he stood his ground in the face of what everyone around him, it's not surprising to him what they do. And when we look at it and we say, well, that's courage. To be able to stand his ground in those values, knowing what everyone around him will do. We do actually say this is incredible courage. He is righteous in this moment. But being righteous doesn't make him a saint. He offers his daughters. And when we look at the commentaries and they're saying, oh my God, what do I do with that offer of the daughters? And the answer they're saying is, sure, offer the daughters. These men aren't interested in women. Of course they're interested in women. This is, you don't offer your daughters to an angry mob. I don't care who they're interested in. So our commentaries are struggling with what do I do with the offer of those daughters? And now what we hear is, it's actually a phenomenon we've all encountered. There are people who show compassion, courage, and protection to strangers, but somehow not to their own family or the ones that are closest to them. This is studied. There are people who will bring the best of their qualities to strangers, but in their home, it's not there. We somehow take liberties with those that are closest to us. We think we don't need to be as patient. We don't need to be as polite. We don't need to be as protective. We don't need to be as hospitable. We don't need to be as giving. But when it comes to a stranger, boy, oh boy, we're there. And we're seeing it with Lot in the extreme, because the text is showing us, watch this. Watch what this man will do. If we narrow our reading of this parsha and this narrative, and we focus to what we think is an expression of sexual preference of the mob, we miss the point. That kind of abuse, of using sexuality as a weapon, rape, it is never an expression of sexual preference. It's always an expression of power and abuse, and it is always looked at that way. We're to walk away from this narrative knowing how to judge a culture. And we judge it by looking at its strangers, by seeing how the strangers will be treated, by seeing how the immigrant will be treated, by seeing how the culture will equalize or not between the treatment of strangers, immigrants, and those who have lived there their entire lives. And then we understand that peace in our homes, shalom bayit, sits on guarding and respecting those we love. If it doesn't start there, it cannot move out from there. And then everything else around us has nothing to sit on. When we look at the parsha and we realize we've been shown Avram and Sarah's home, we see what it is they're doing, how they behave. When it's not God at their doorstep, when it's strangers at their doorstep. And then it juxtaposes to, now look what you could see in the world around you. It is a clear message of saying which value we shape our homes on, which are the red flags we look for in the cultures around us. How do we shape our homes with the idea of, it is not always about the stranger and the immigrant. It starts with understanding how I treat people with how I treat them in my home. The respect, the courage, and the protection of the home. We don't want to get sidetracked by a moment in the text that does definitely draw our attention. And not to say that Judaism does not raise questions about this, but it raises it in the book of Leviticus, clearly. Here it is not clearly raising it. And when we read it that way, we actually run the risk of missing the larger messages, our homes, those we love, the culture around us, and how to build a world that is a world we want to live in, we want to invite God to live with us, and we want our children to inherit.